Hello Year 10 and welcome to Sequences Lesson 7. We're going to be looking at a new type of sequence today called geometric sequences, but we're going to start with the answers from yesterday's lesson. So the answers are on the screen. Could you pause the video and mark your work? Okay, so today we're looking at geometric sequences. We've done two types of sequence so far. One is arithmetic sequences, where we're adding a consistent number every time, and one is quadratic sequences, which are based on the square numbers. Geometric sequences, instead of adding a consistent amount every time, we're multiplying by the same amount every time. So on the screen in front of you, you can see an example of a geometric sequence. And you can probably see that what's happening with this sequence, the term-to-term rule, is that we're multiplying by 2 every time. So this is the term-to-term rule. It's how I get from one term to the next term. And in this case, it's multiply by 2. And for a geometric sequence, we call this the common ratio, whereas for an arithmetic sequence, we called it the common difference. So how do we work out the common ratio? Well, sometimes, as in this example, you can just see that you're doubling every time, and therefore you're multiplying by 2. But sometimes it won't be so easy. So if you need to calculate it, you can take one term and divide it by the previous term, and that will give you the common ratio. Now, you can see lots of examples of me doing this here. In the first case, I've taken 4 and divided by 2, which is the second term divided by the first, and that gives me an answer of 2. Or I could have done 8 divided by 4, so that's the third term divided by the second. And then I could have done the fourth divided by the third, and so on. It doesn't matter which 2 you choose, provided you have chosen 2 consecutive terms, and then you're dividing one by the previous term. Okay, so here's another example of a geometric sequence. So remember, you are multiplying every time to get your next term. Could you pause the video and find the term-to-term rule and then generate the next 3 terms? Okay, so you could probably see what was going on here, but just in case, if you needed to calculate the common ratio, you need one term divided by the previous one. So I've gone for 12 divided by 4, the second term divided by the first term, and that's given me 3. So I'm multiplying by 3 every time. That's the term-to-term rule. And then I'm going to keep going, multiplying by 3 and getting the next 3 terms in my sequence. Okay, here's another example, starting to get slightly more tricky because we've got decimals. Remember, if you can't just see what the common ratio is, you can divide one term by the previous term to work it out. So here you need to pause the video, find the term-to-term rule, and then generate the next 3 terms. Okay, so to find the term-to-term rule, or the common ratio, I'm going to do 0.5 divided by 1, which gives me 0.5. So I am multiplying by 0.5 each time. You might also have decided that we are halving, so you're dividing by 2. And that's fine as a term-to-term rule. To say the term-to-term rule is divide by 2 is perfect, but the common ratio has to be a multiply. So multiply by 0.5 again to give me 0.125, and again, and again. Here's another example. This one's looking a bit interesting because we've got some positive terms and some negative terms. But the way of finding the common ratio is the same. If you take one term and divide it by the previous, it will give you the common ratio, and you can then use that to generate the next 3 terms. So pause the video and see if you can work this one out. Okay, so -9 divided by 3 gives me the common ratio, and that, of course, a negative divided by a positive is a negative, so that gives me -3. And so I'm multiplying by -3 every time, and because a negative multiplied by a negative gives me a positive, that's how come my terms are alternating between being positive and negative. So the next one, 27 multiplied by -3 gives me -81. And then -81 multiplied by -3 gives me positive 243. And then again for the final term, -729. Okay, so can you pause the video and for this example, find the term-to-term rule and the next 3 terms? Okay, so you might have decided here again that the terms are halving every time, which as a term-to-term rule is fine. But a common ratio always has to be a multiplication and not a division. So if you're asked for the term-to-term rule, you can say divide by 2. But if you're asked for a common ratio, it should be a multiply. So I've worked this out as 50 divided by 100. And if I think of it as a fraction here, I can simplify this fraction to be a half. And so I am multiplying by a half every time. And of course, that's the same as dividing by 2. Dividing by a number is the same as multiplying by its reciprocal. So multiply 25 by a half and I get 12.5. Multiply by a half again, 6.25. Multiply by a half again, 3.125. Okay, slightly different question here. We aren't being asked for the term-to-term rule or for the next term. We're being asked to find the missing term. So in this case, what I'm going to do is work out what I've got to multiply 20 by to get 11.25 by dividing 11.25 by 20. And I did this on my calculator and it gave it back to me as a fraction, which is actually perfect. You'll see why in a minute. So I'm multiplying by 9/16. Now, if I want to know what to multiply by to get not from one term to 2 terms ahead, but from one term to the next term, well, to get all the way to 11.25, I'd have multiplied by something and then by that same thing again. In other words, to skip and get all the way there, I would have squared that number. So to get back to what one of them is going to be, I need to square root 9/16. And if I keep it as a fraction, that's easy because I know the square root of 9 is 3 and the square root of 16 is 4. And so I must have been multiplying by 3/4 and then 3/4 again. And that's how I get to 9/16 to skip a space. And so now to work out my missing term, I need to do 20 multiplied by 3/4. In other words, divide by 4 and multiply by 3. So divide by 4 gives me 5, multiply by 3 gives me 15. So my missing term must be 15. Okay, so here is your task for today. You're going to need to pause the video and do the workings into your maths book. So question number 1, you've just got to work out whether each of these sequences is arithmetic, in other words, we're adding an amount every time, geometric, in other words, we're multiplying by an amount every time, or neither of those things, a different type of sequence, so other. Question 2, you're given the first term and you're given the term-to-term rule, and so you've got to work out the first 4 terms in each of the sequences. And then for question 3, we've got to find the term-to-term rule and then use it to find the next term in the sequence. For question 4, it's going to be similar to that last example, so these are a little bit more tricky. You've got to work out what the term-to-term rule is, even though you've got a step skipped, and then you've got to work out what the missing term is. So pause the video and see if you can answer these questions.